If you follow the news within the past 48 hours, needless to say that the relationship between China and the US at this moment is completely in turmoil. As a matter of fact, the entire world is paying attention how China is reacting to this political interference from the Western Hemisphere. But meanwhile, we also need to take a closer look regarding the political and also this economic relationship between China with some of the countries in Southeast Asia. For example, the Philippines. Not too long ago, if you follow our show, that you know this country recently elected a brand new president. And based on the recent rhetoric, the relationship between the Philippines and China could also be standing at the crossroads. So that's why today it's crucial that we need to examine, or should I say, re-examine this ongoing political and also this economic partnership between China and the Philippines. Now, join our show today, it's Professor Enrico Gloria. Professor Gloria is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines. His areas of interest includes Chinese foreign policy, Philippine foreign policy discourses, and the major power status. Now, without further ado, Professor Gloria, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will, and thank you again for having me, and great to see you once again.
Absolutely, Professor. The pleasure is all mine. Now, let's get started. As I mentioned before, the relationship between the Philippines and China, should I say, has always been very positive, and we're trying to maintain this positive, mutual beneficial relationship. But meanwhile, based on the report and also based on the recent rhetoric from the newly elected Filipino president, and I want to read something to you. This is what he said, and I quote, "In the area of foreign policy, I will not preside over any process that will abandon even 1 square inch of territory of the Republic of the Philippines to any foreign power." Professor, back in the days, we know that the territorial dispute has been one of the top or one of the hottest topics between the two nations. But recently, President Marcos gave out such a firm address. What do you make of all this?
Okay, so the thing with that particular address, it was delivered during the first State of the Nation address of the newly elected president. No? And in previous sonas, that's what we call it, the speech. No? In previous sonas as well, for instance, if you look at the first sona of President Duterte, similar rhetoric can be identified. A similar rhetoric in terms of paying the right homage, if you will, in respecting the spirit of the arbitral award, no? Especially since Duterte had his first SONA in 2016, the year the award was given to the Philippines, no? So it needs to be understood that it's not really surprising for Filipino presidents, no, to say the nice things or to say the things that would sort of bring public opinion to their side, right? And going back to the Marcos speech, no, if you would notice, during that particular speech, that particular statement garnered the longest standing ovation and applause from the audience. And the audience are mostly legislators, diplomats, and other important people, no, from the political elite of the Philippines. No? So having said that, it's not really that surprising to hear Ferdinand Marcos say that. I would be more interested in seeing the follow-through or observing the follow-through to that statement, because words are simply just that. No? So, and as you have mentioned, we haven't really reached the 100-day mark. Yes, Marcos is already done with his first month. No?
That's right.
But we have yet to see whether Marcos will actually commit truthfully to the words that he mentioned a while in the first SONA.
You know, Professor, it's so interesting that, again, when we look at this relationship between China and the Philippines, given the fact that Philippines today play or continues to play such a significant role in Southeast Asia. You know, again, not only creating this political influence, but also this economic interest. But meanwhile, when we look at the relationship from this economic power or from this economic shift, and we know that Filipino government is very much interested in reaching out to the Chinese government. Given the fact that Chinese president, again, under this Belt and Road Initiative, and also for him to attend this upcoming G20 summit in November in Bali, Indonesia, again, China is making greater effort trying to maintain this positive and healthful relationship with any countries in Southeast Asia, particularly with the Philippines. So my next question to you is, even though that Marcos was addressing to all the officials or legislatures, during the State of a Nation address, but meanwhile, how serious do you think China today should consider the effort by the Philippines? So in other words, what do you think the Chinese government could interpret this sentence in a positive instead of in a being negative way?
I think the Chinese government is also in a wait and see position. This is not the first time that our Chinese counterpart, for instance, have observed such strong rhetoric from Filipino head of state. Even Duterte before, even when he was already outgoing president, have already said something similar, with respect to the arbitral award. I think China at this point, already recognizes that Filipino politicians, most especially the president, is under deep pressure from the Filipino public to actually say these things and to because if you say otherwise, it's actually tantamount to something like treason. So it's really a taboo topic that the president must definitely say that he supports protecting the rights of Filipinos in the West Philippine Sea and that they will abide by the arbitral award. Having said that, it's also important to note, by the way, that President Marcos appointed a career diplomat, so a career diplomat at the helm of the Department of Foreign Affairs. So that's also an interesting development because the diplomat that he appointed, meanwhile, released a much stronger statement, saying that the arbitral award will be the basis or the foundation of Filipino foreign policy with respect to the West Philippine Sea. Now, that coming from the DFA secretary is something to watch out for. So I think right now, China is closely watching the developments. I don't think they are skeptical of the current government in terms of continuing the better relations that we've achieved in the past 6 years. I think we're going to see this particular government still continue to reap gains from our good relations with China. But just like before, China will definitely keep us at bay, especially given that the United States is still there. The United States is still a formal ally of the Philippines. Nevertheless, I don't think that China shift its point of view with respect to the Philippines just because of that statement.
Professor, again, I want to talk about the role of U.S. since you also touched on a little bit more. A lot more political scientists today believe that Marcos is neither following the footsteps of his pro-Beijing predecessor nor picking up where more U.S. friendly presidents left off. Given the fact that today, as also I mentioned in the intro, the relationship today between U.S. and China is completely in turmoil. I mean, again, there are many reasons, and there's no need to go any further. But meanwhile, for countries as Philippines, as Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, even the list can go on and on and on. On one hand, no one is willing to take the side between the two largest economies in the world. But on the other hand, to a larger extent, you have to take a side in order to maintain at least the stability between the relationships. So my next question to you is, if some of the political scientists, specifically related to Asia or the Philippines, were right, how would you think that Marcos today can handle this tension between China and the US without specifically taking side or getting the country of Philippines involved in the tension?
So what you've just described there is really the hedging strategy, which is really the heart of foreign policy decisions of all Southeast Asian countries. I think as small powers or middle powers caught in between China and the United States, the most logical and rational direction for these countries to go is to, as you've mentioned, hedge between these two powers. And the election of the new president in the Philippines, just like elections in our political history, symbolizes an opportunity to sort of jumpstart to see what works, what doesn't work in terms of our foreign policy. And I think this particular administration has seen that at the very least, the previous administration's approach to the United States hasn't really brought us gains. Our approach to China was correct. We basically improved our relations with China. There were gains that were made. The two sides are now talking now more than ever as compared to Aquino regime. But this time around, it's the other side which suffered. So it was the U.S., our relationship with the U.S. So if you think about that, the Philippines has struggled to maintain a hedging strategy between China and the US for the past 12 years, for the past two administrations. So this particular government will have its work cut out for itself. It has to ensure that it adopts a correct foreign policy that neither leans close to China or the US. And that is why, as I was saying a while ago, I think it was just a good decision on behalf of the Marcos government to have Secretary Manalo at the helm of the foreign affairs. Secretary Manalo had 40 years experience of being a career diplomat, and I think this is the first time that we have a career diplomat as foreign secretary. In the previous years, it has always been appointed, political appointee of the president. So it could be someone close to them or friends, etc. But this time, we know someone who really knows what to do and how to approach it carefully. So to answer your question in terms of how to do it effectively at this point, I'm also interested to see what Secretary Manalo will do and what President Marcos will do. But I think what needs to be clear at this point is that I agree with what Secretary Manalo has said, that whatever our decision will be, there are some red lines or there are some priorities that cannot be negotiated from the perspective of the Philippines. First and foremost would be the arbitral award. Whether China will get mad, whether the US will be pleased, whether other countries will get mad or will be pleased, I think it's up for the Philippines to be the first state to respect the spirit of the award. And then everything from there should proceed. It should be the basis of our national interest. Second would be to adopt a longer term outlook, a more consistent outlook to our foreign policy. So prior to this, our foreign policy have always been reactive, or as a reaction to a particular crisis that happened, to particular shifts in the region. But this time around, I think it's time for the Philippines to craft a long-term strategic outlook when it comes to its national interest and to its foreign policy. So again, my first point will come there. The arbitral award should be part of that decision calculus. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Sure, it sounds great. Professor, I want to move on with our question regarding the predecessor, Rodriguez Duterte. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, previous relationship between China and the US under Duterte has been very rocky, as well as the relationship between US and the Philippines. But meanwhile, we know towards the end of his presidency under Rodriguez Duterte, the relationship between China and the US actually improved drastically. So in other words, I don't want to exaggerate the relationship to say it was very fruitful and productive, but at least in terms of picking the sides or in terms of picking the allies wisely, Duterte, correct me if I'm wrong, was leaning towards China better than leaning towards the US. Now, my next question to you is, how much influence does Duterte have today over Marcos' foreign policy in terms of dealing with US and China? Because the reason why I'm asking question, because we know that whenever a new president was elected, the predecessors tend to give some wise or tend to share some of the previous historical relationship or historical lessons with the successor. But today, after 30 days, I want to know that how much influence does Duterte have today over Marcos' foreign policy, or could we expect something different, not only towards China, towards US, but towards the rest of the parts of the world, that Marcos' government is going to reshape the foreign policy, which will be completely different, or at least somehow different from the predecessor?
I think in terms of Duterte's influence, in the current administration's foreign policy, there will be a bit of at least consideration on part of President Marcos whenever he will adopt certain foreign policy decisions. Probably he would consider at the very least if it's going to be consistent with the previous policies. But I don't think it will be very crucial to the effect that it's a game changer for the current administration. My sense is that this particular administration wants to chart its own path as well when it comes to Philippine foreign policy. So as I have mentioned a while ago, I think this administration, whether with the tacit approval, support, or pressure of the former President Duterte, I think this administration is still committed to pursuing good relations with China. Again, whether or not Duterte is in the picture. As you would observe Marcos prior to 2022, even when he was a senator, he was already friendly towards China's initiatives in the Philippines. So there's precedent for his actions towards China. But at the same time, like I've said, I think this particular administration, similar to other administrations in Philippine political history, are determined to chart their own path, so to speak, when it comes to Philippine foreign policy, which I think is ultimately a room for opportunity for the Philippines in general. It's a room for opportunity to again restart the things that we did wrong and to continue the things that are good. And for the things that needs improvement, if you will, this is where the U.S. alliance, Philippine-U.S. alliance, would come into the picture. And as we have talked about in the previous episode, President Marcos has a different vision, I think, with respect to our alliance with the United States. He's more level-headed. He hasn't said any cuss words towards the United States, unlike Duterte. He seems open to exploring expanding the partnership towards other productive areas. So we will see that President Marcos will sort of chart his own direction as well when it comes to foreign policy. So Duterte is still in the picture, probably influencing the current government through his daughter, Vice President Sara Duterte. But ultimately, I think this new government will seek to chart its own direction in foreign policy, even in other areas.
Professor, I know your time is very precious. I get two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about this upcoming trip for Secretary of the State from the U.S., Anthony Blinken. And based on the report, that Blinken is going to travel to the Philippines and this year, hopefully maybe in September, if the weather and also the conditions are right. Now, during the trip, again, based on the information that we accumulated, the number one is to address this what we called South China Sea dispute with the Philippines from the U.S. side, and also that his intention is to discuss this bilateral effort to strengthen the U.S.-Philippines alliance and also the cooperation on energy, trade, and investment. My first question to you is, how much do you think the Philippines should really, what we call, trust the U.S. at this moment, based on this energy, trade, and investment agreement? Given the fact that we know that at this moment, U.S. it's completely in hot water in terms of this relationship with some of the countries in Southeast Asia, because China is not going anywhere. So in other words, if U.S. continue to poke the bear, with all those sensitive and rather critical issues that really matters to China, and eventually that countries as Philippines could easily walk away from this relationship to say, hey, listen, I don't want to create a war with China. I don't want to create a war with the U.S. So why can't I just be a bystander? Why can't I just stand as a bench player? So that's why going back to the question is, how much do you think that Philippines today can trust the U.S. in terms of or continuing this trade investment relationship, energy, and also this ongoing political cooperation?
I think, our partnership with the United States have been very vibrant even before China came into the picture. Public opinion-wise, the president would, it's in the benefit of President Marcos to actually engage United States in these cooperative areas, because the public would like that. No? And in terms of whether China will get mad or there are going to be repercussions with other engagements with China, I do believe that from a small power and a developing country's perspective, it's important that we approach cooperation with major powers from absolute gains perspective, meaning that we stand to gain in all these cooperative agreements, whether from China or US. No? We cannot afford to see it as an either-or type of scenario, right? So all aid is welcome, right? Whether from EU, from Russia, from US or China. At the end of the day, the Philippines would need all its help that it could get. No? And if it's going to be cooperation in areas, in crucial areas where the Philippines stand to really benefit, the Philippines would lose more rather than lose more if it doesn't trust the United States in these cooperative areas. No? But with more to the Blinken visit, no, I think this is also crucial in as far as really being clarified, if you will, no, on what the current government plans to do with the United States, especially with respect to the statements that were previously made with respect to the arbitral award, to not surrendering an inch of territory in the West Philippine Sea. No, so it would be very interesting whether those statements or similar commitments will be voiced out in the Blinken visit, and whether security commitment of the United States will be mentioned, no? Because that's the number one problem as well between US and Philippines. No? The Philippines feel that US is not as committed to the security guarantee it promises in the alliance, unlike, for say, the same promise in Japan. US is more committed to that. But this time around, I think people will be watching, no? How far will Secretary Blinken publicly say that it will be committed to any act of aggression in the West Philippine Sea, committed in supporting the Philippine side, of course. So those are the things to watch.
Professor Gloria, I want to wrap up our conversation with something very simple. We know that for a country, when a leader, after taking over, so in other words, becoming the new presidents, a lot of issues actually matter not only to the audience outside the country, but also what's more important is the domestic affairs. Again, only after 30 days that Marcos was elected to be the next president of the Philippines. As a national of the Philippines and also as citizens in the Philippines, can you help us to understand what are some of the major issues that Marcos continue to address, and also ahead of, again, he hasn't reached the 100 days, but what are some other major critical issues, not just matter to the foreign policy, but also let's talk about this domestic affairs. Can you share with us? And also, how do you think that Marcos is going to address those critical domestic issues?
Well, from the recent State of the Nation address, I think the main message there was to effectively combat the crisis that was the result of the global pandemic. I think the number one concern for the Philippines right now is to sustain the economic and health recovery that we're currently working for the past 2 years. And the Philippines, probably one of the slowest countries in terms of recovery in managing the pandemic. We had the longest lockdown in the world. So Filipinos are closely looking at that, whether they're going to be locked down still, although the president said that under his time there are not going to be any lockdowns. So vaccination rate, we still need to improve on that. A lot of vaccines are expiring as we speak because because the government is having a hard time reaching to those areas or to those population who needs to be vaccinated. Economic development is a top priority, especially since the pandemic really erased a lot of the gains that we have made pre-pandemic. So the country wants to achieve upper middle income status by 2024 or 2025. So that's one of the objectives that we're setting ourselves for. Education is also one of the main issues that we're looking at, since also this country is probably one of the longer ones who have committed to online or remote learning. And until now, schools are being held virtually. So that's why the president appointed Secretary Sara Duterte as the secretary for the Department of Education. So it means that the president and this government is serious in getting our act right, if you will, in education sector. So our main goal right now, I think, is to ensure that we transition to face-to-face classes. So there's a looming educational crisis that needs to be corrected as far as the Philippines is concerned. Other areas, FDIs, so ensuring employment in the Philippines. I think the president is committed in providing jobs for Filipinos. So through the attraction of foreign direct investments, and also through the development of our infrastructure roadmap. So the previous administration, Duterte administration, its main priority was really infrastructure development. So building trains, building subways, airports, not only in Metro Manila, but in the entirety of Philippines. And I think that this current administration would continue that goal, if not double down on that goal, which is good news for the Philippines. I think it's high time that we improve our infrastructure. If you come here, you can just imagine the traffic in Metro Manila. It's faster to fly from Philippines to Hong Kong than to travel within Metro Manila. That's how bad traffic is in here. So there's prioritization on that level. So those are some of the areas that I think will keep this administration busy in the next